Have you ever felt that life has driven you into a dead end, when every door slams shut, money runs dry, loved ones leave, one by one, and darkness seems to swallow the entire future? That is exactly where this story begins. A widowed woman so poor that she had only a few coins left in her pocket unexpectedly encountered a dying cowboy in the middle of a desolate desert. No one would have thought she would stop. No one would have thought she would share her very last drops of water. Yet she did what most of us would turn away from. She chose compassion at the precise moment when she herself was falling apart. Carl Jung once said, "The best way to confront the shadow in oneself is to confront the shadow in others." She did not know that this tiny act had awakened an ancient archetype, the forgotten savior buried deep within the collective unconscious. And from that single moment, the fate of her entire family was reversed forever, in a way no imagination would dare dream of. Today, in the next 12 minutes, you will witness as a true story about the shadow, about the anima, about the miraculous synchronicity, and an individuation journey so beautiful it hurts. Stay with me, because this story did not merely change that woman's life. It may forever change the way you look at the adversity in your own. Press play and step with me into the realm of the unconscious. Are you ready? The wind howled like a lost soul in the endless night of the desolate Wyoming plains, 1892. The blizzard lashed its whip against the rotting planks of the tiny ranch where Abigail Thornton, a 32-year-old widow with deep blue eyes scarred by invisible wounds, was fighting to keep the flame of survival alive. That night, as thunder roared like a curse rising from the collective unconscious, Abigail did not sleep. 6-year-old Lucy trembled in her mother's arms, while 9-year-old Benjamin whispered, "Mama, the snow is going to bury us all." In just 15 more days, the bank would seize the last 160 acres, the land her husband Elias had bled to buy. A debt of $350, an astronomical sum for a woman who had nothing left but calloused hands and 2 young children. But fate, as Carl Jung understood it, is never a random enemy. It is synchronicity, the miraculous alignment between the personal unconscious and the flow of the cosmos. Abigail, driven by the instinct of a mother on the verge of despair, heard a faint groan coming from the old stable. In the midst of the ferocious storm, she rushed out her tattered cloak, flapping like the wings of a bird beaten by the gale. That was the moment the archetype of the Saviour awakened within her, the ancient pattern hidden in the collective unconscious, compelling a human being to act beyond primal fear. Inside the dark, snow-flooded stable, she found him, a stranger, tall and broad, yet dying. Blood pooled crimson on the muddy floor, deep gashes in his shoulder and chest, his breath rattling like a soul slipping from its body. He wore an expensive leather coat, but his face was ashen, his sharp brown eyes, half open, half closed, concealing a pain far deeper than the stab wounds. "Don't touch me," he rasped, his voice hoarse with weariness, but Abigail did not listen. She tore strips from her skirt for bandages, dragged him into the house, and stoked the fire to warm that ice-cold body. While stitching his wounds with crude needle and thread, a skill learned from her mother, a frontier midwife, she whispered, "Who are you? Why are you here in this storm?" He only shook his head, a flash of darkness flaring in his eyes, the mark of a shadow not yet faced. Abigail Thornton was no fragile woman. 2 years earlier, her world had collapsed when Elias, her beloved husband, tall and full of ambition, fell to lung disease. That was what the doctor said. But Benjamin, the boy, sensitive to the secrets of adults, had whispered to his mother, "I saw Uncle Harlan, Papa's partner, slip something into Papa's whiskey. Elias had not died of illness. He had been poisoned, murdered by the greed of land-hungry men in the nearby town. Harlan and his gang had coveted the fertile Thornton Ranch, its abundant underground springs and lush pastures that could feed thousands of cattle. Abigail knew the truth, but she had no proof. She stayed silent, shielding her children from that darkness, yet it gnawed at her soul every night. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate, Carl Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective. Unconscious Collected Works, Volume 9I, Par 513. Abigail was living that very curse, and unconscious, filled with resentment and terror, was steering her straight toward ruin. Her 2 children were the only light left in her darkness. Benjamin, 9 years old, thin, with unruly brown hair, and the intelligent eyes he inherited from his father, helped his mother tend the goats, mend fences, and dreamed of one day riding like a real cowboy. But the fear of losing their home had made him irritable. He snapped at his little sister more and more. Lucy, 6 years old, clutching her handmade rag doll and flashing gap-toothed smiles, was the pure anima of the family, the embodiment of innocence and hope that Jung described as the personification of the feminine principle. In the male Kai, Ion Collected Works, Volume 9 Par 20. Lucy often sang her mother to sleep with old folk songs, but lately her dreams had begun to change. Mama, I dreamed of an ugly man with horns, but a white horse came to save us. Those dreams in Jungian terms were messages from the unconscious, harbingers of the coming individuation, the journey of integrating the shadow to reach the wholeness of the self. The stranger, Nathaniel Cole, was no ordinary man. In his delirium he muttered about bounty hunters and gold beneath the earth. Abigail did not know it yet, but he was the owner of the richest ranch in the Black Hills, an empire of 10,000 acres, thousands of purebred cattle, and a secret gold mine. He had been working in stealth. Nathaniel, 38 years old, was a solitary man hunted by the very men who once served him, Harlan. The same man who poisoned Elias, now working for an East Coast land syndicate, desperate to swallow the coal empire whole. They had ambushed him on the trail back from Denver, stabbed him nearly to death, stolen his horse and left him for the storm. He had escaped, guided by instinct alone, to the Thornton Ranch, a perfect synchronicity where the collective unconscious orchestrated the meeting of 2 shadows. When Nathaniel awoke the next morning, beside the warm hearth, the scent of Abigail's potato soup filling the air, he looked at her with complicated eyes, gratitude laced with suspicion. "You saved my life. Why weren't you afraid I might be a bad man?" Abigail gave a sad smile. "Because if I had turned away, I would have lost myself." That was the first moment of Jungian magic. Jung once said everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves, from the 1932 seminar, later quoted in The Symbolic Life. Nathaniel, carrying his own shadow, greed, isolation, and the terror of betrayal, was staring into Abigail's mirror. Her shadow was resentment and despair. Her act of saving him was not mere compassion. It was the confrontation of her own shadow through another. This is not simply the tale of a destitute widow. It is a symphony of the human psyche, a woman standing at the abyss, where the social persona, dutiful wife, devoted mother, shatters, exposing a wounded anima and a furious shadow. Her 2 children represent a fragile future, while Nathaniel embodies the archetype of the wounded hero, the one who will guide the journey of individuation. in just 15 days from this dead-end fate, will reverse in ways no one could foresee. Nathaniel will not only save the ranch, he will unmask the truth behind Elias's death, exact justice for Abigail, and open an everlasting legacy for her family. But everything begins with the moment she chose to save a stranger in the blizzard, the act that awakened the self within. Imagine yourself in Abigail's place, broken, hopeless. Would you dare open the door to another's shadow, so that it might heal your own? Seen through the Jungian lens, this story is not merely motivational. It is a map for crossing your own personal darkness. Stay with me, because the next part will reveal how synchronicity transformed a man on the edge of death into the greatest benefactor in frontier history. From that fateful blizzard night onward, Abigail's small ranch was no longer a refuge. It became an arena of the unconscious. In the days that followed, the air inside the old log house grew thick with tense silence between two deeply wounded souls. Every evening Abigail stood by the hearth hands, trembling as she changed Nathaniel's bandages, because each touch against the hard skin of this stranger awakened memories of Elias like a sharp knife. The husband who once held her was now nothing more than cold ashes. She feared men, feared the strength that could turn into violence, feared the warmth that could once again be torn away. Yet she could not let him die. "If I let you die," she whispered to herself, "I will kill the last shred of humanity left in me." That was her first inner battle, between the terror of being hurt again and the sacred command of the anima, the primal compassion Jung called the archetype of life, symbols of transformation, CW 5 Par 508. Nathaniel, in the grip of high fever, at first only lied, "I'm just a drifter who was robbed." But when he looked into Abigail's eyes that held an ocean of suffering, he could no longer hide. One afternoon, as the snow stopped falling and weak sunlight slipped through the cracks, he took her hand, voice hoarse. "I am Nathaniel Cole, the man this whole territory calls the king of the Black Hills." Abigail froze. The man lying in her sickbed owned nearly half the valley. The man her husband had once dreamed of partnering with, the man rumor claimed had been dead inside for years. They began to speak of those they had lost. Nathaniel told her of Margaret, his gentle wife who died of scarlet fever, along with the daughter she never got to hold. "I lost my soul the day they buried my little girl," he said, staring into the distance. Abigail wept. For the first time in 2 years, she cried for someone else who carried the same wound. In that moment, Jung's words rang painfully true. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both a transformed modern man in search of a soul, 1933. But no sooner had light appeared than darkness descended. Clayton Voss, the banker, his face cold as granite, was the living embodiment of the collective shadow Jung warned about: greed, legitimized by law and religion. He had built an entire system to devour the valley, predatory loans, foreclosures, then buying the land for pennies. Anyone who resisted suddenly came down with lung disease, like Elias Thornton. When word spread that Nathaniel Cole was hiding at the widow's house, Voss smiled wickedly. A golden chance to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. He sent the sheriff, long since bought and paid for, and a mob of sanctimonious townspeople to Abigail's door. Whore, they screamed, living in sin with a man and daring to raise children. The church barred Lucy and Benjamin from Sunday school. We cannot let the children of God be tainted. The pastor declared, unable to meet Abigail's eyes, the persona she had clung to for 2 years, the respectable widow, the pitiable, good woman, was ripped to shreds without mercy. She stood there surrounded by wolves in human clothing, and for the first time felt her own shadow snarling a rage that wanted to kill. The peak of cruelty came on a moonless night. The stable suddenly erupted in roaring red flames. Sell the land, or the whole house burns, voices shouted over the crackling wood. Benjamin clung to his sobbing sister. Lucy screamed for her mother. Abigail burst outside, clutching her husband's old rifle, eyes blood red. That was when Nathaniel, wounds still unhealed, rose to his feet. For the first time in years he felt alive. He sent an urgent signal to his loyal men. Back at the main ranch, 30 riders thundered through the lingering storm guns at the ready. And then inside the house, shaking with fire and screams, Nathaniel dropped to one knee before Abigail, amid smoke and blood. Marry me, right now. Marriage will shield you and the children from their laws. I swear I will protect this family with my last breath. Abigail looked at him, looked into eyes no longer those of an arrogant land baron, but of a man who had found his soul again. She nodded. The wedding took place that very night, beneath the burning stable's glow, with Benjamin and Lucy as witnesses, and a terrified pastor held at gunpoint. But before the wedding night could taste each other's warmth, the first gunshot cracked. More than a dozen of Voss's gunmen swarmed in, determined to finish them both. Nathaniel fought like a wounded beast defending its den. Abigail, for the first time in her life, fired back, her bullet tearing into an attacker's shoulder, blood splattering her face. In that instant she was no longer the fragile widow. She had integrated her shadow, the rage, the ruthlessness, the power buried for so many years. Jung once wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Psychological types, CW6 par. 102. Abigail did exactly that. Amid smoke fire and gunfire, she became the most complete version of herself. The battle ended as dawn broke the bodies of the attackers, strewn across the blood-red snow. Nathaniel held Abigail tightly amid the ashes and whispered, "From now on, this land, this life, everything I have, is yours." But both of them knew the real war had only just begun, because Clayton Voss was still alive, and he would not stop until the entire valley belonged to him, or until he was dead. Stay with me. The final part will show you how a woman, once abandoned by the entire world, rose up, used her own shadow to rewrite her fate, and became a living legend of the frontier. This is not merely a love story. This is the most complete individuation journey you will ever witness. From the ashes of the burned, denounced stable, the dawn brought not only light, but an ancient power, the power of a human being who had dared to stare straight into their own darkness, and into the darkness of the entire community. Nathaniel Cole, the man once called the King of the Black Hills, yet whose soul had died the day he lost his wife and child, now stood tall in Abigail's yard, dried blood on his shirt hands, still trembling from the night's fight. He looked at Abigail, the woman who had just shot back at her enemies to protect her children, and understood that their shared journey of individuation had entered its final stage, no longer fleeing the shadow, but wielding it as a weapon to forge justice. 3 days later, the entire town of Deadwood shook when Nathaniel rode into the main square, followed by 15 loyal gunmen and a heavy iron chest. He opened the chest. In front of the whispering crowd inside were Dr. Morrison's ledgers, meticulously recording every vial of poison ordered by Clayton Voss, every name diagnosed with lung disease before they died, including Elias Thornton. There were also signed statements from 3 former bank employees who had stayed silent out of fear, but who now, seeing Cole alive, chose truth. Nathaniel needed only to read aloud one line from Dr. Morrison's notebook: "Delivered arsenic compound to Mr. Voss for Mr. Thornton's whiskey, as requested." The entire square fell dead silent. The town's false persona, its veneer of morality, its blind faith in church and bank, shattered like struck glass. Jung wrote in Ion, "No tree, it is said, can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell." CW 9E Par 418. That truth now stood in stark relief. For justice to bloom, the entire community had to acknowledge that they had aided the devil with their silence, and they began to change. The first to step forward was the general store owner, who had once spat at Abigail. She fell to her knees in the street sobbing, "I was afraid. I was wrong." Then the pastor, then the fathers who had forbidden their children to play with Benjamin and Lucy. They came to Abigail's door, carrying bread, milk, and choked apologies. The collective shadow of the entire town was being brought into the light, and once the darkness was named, light finally had room to enter. In the meantime, Nathaniel did something. No one expected. He quietly bought up every note Voss still held, not only Abigail's, but those of nearly 100 other ranches in the valley. With a single signature, he erased the $350 debt that had hung over the Thornton family like a sword. He handed the papers to Abigail in front of the 2 children, his voice low but unshakable. This land was never yours to lose. It was always yours to keep. Abigail clutched the documents to her chest, tears falling onto the words, "paid in full." For the first time in 2 years, she felt what Jung called the self, the whole, an undivided center of the psyche blossoming inside her chest. The trial lasted only 2 days. Clayton Voss, the man who once sat behind the banker's desk with a cold smile, now stood in chains, his face twisted with terror. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses too many. The judge, an honest man brought in from Cheyenne, delivered the sentence of hanging after just 15 minutes of deliberation. On the day of the execution, the entire town gathered on the western hill. A cold wind whistled through the new rope. Voss was led up the wooden gallows, his eyes frantically searching the crowd until they found Abigail. She stood there, hand tightly clasped in Nathaniel's, Benjamin and Lucy behind her. When the trapdoor dropped and Voss's body jerked once, and then hung still, Abigail did not close her eyes. She looked straight ahead. She watched until his feet stopped kicking. In that moment, the pain of losing Elias did not vanish, but it was no longer an open wound. It had become part of her, integrated, transformed. Jung once said, "I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become." Abigail had chosen. She chose to become a survivor, a fierce mother and a woman who dared to love again. After the hanging, the valley was changed forever. Nathaniel transferred a vast portion of his land and cattle into the names of Abigail and the children, not as a gift, but as recognition that she had saved him long before he ever saved her. They rebuilt the stable larger and finer than before, and named it Margaret's Bun, in memory of Nathaniel's wife, an unborn daughter. Benjamin learned to ride from his new father, while Lucy planted wildflowers around the house, the kind her mother said only grow from ground that has once burned. The townspeople no longer called her the widow Thornton. They called her the woman who faced the devil and won. And one spring evening, as the sun bled crimson behind the Black Hills, Nathaniel and Abigail stood on the hill overlooking the valley that now belonged to them forever. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and whispered, "We didn't just survive the darkness. We turned it into light." Abigail smiled the first smile with no trace of bitterness left in it, because we dared to look at it together. This is not simply the story of a poor widow being saved. This is the most vivid living proof of the Jungian journey, when you face your own shadow and the shadow of another, when you allow synchronicity to guide you, when you dare to integrate both light and darkness. You do not merely save yourself, you save a part of the world. Remember this story every time life drives you into a dead end. Remember that even in the blackest night, there is always a dying stranger at your door, and the smallest act you do for them may open an entirely new horizon. Because, as Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If this video touched you, share it with someone who needs light right now. See you again in the next realm of the unconscious. After the day Clayton Voss hung between heaven and earth, the valley no longer kept its old name. People began calling it Resurrection Valley, for from the ashes of greed and fear, a new community had risen, more honest, more courageous. But for Abigail Thornton, now legally, Abigail Cole, the true resurrection, did not take place in the square of justice. It began quietly, the moment she chose to leave the old log house, filled with the ghosts of the past, and move with Nathaniel and the children to the main coal ranch, an empire that stretched to the horizon, where thousands of cattle grazed beneath a sky no longer under threat. The great stone and oak house that had stood cold as an abandoned palace since the day Margaret and their unborn daughter left Nathaniel was now alive again, with children's laughter echoing down long hallways. Benjamin, the 9-year-old boy, who had only ever known his father through faded photographs, rode for the first time on a tall horse Nathaniel himself had chosen, shouting with joy as the wind whipped through his hair. Lucy ran barefoot across the new grass, clutching her old rag doll, singing lullabies to the newborn lambs with the very songs her mother once sang to her on hungry, freezing nights. Nathaniel stood silently on the porch steps, watching the scene, and for the first time in 10 years, he wept not from loss, but from being found again. The marriage between Abigail and Nathaniel began as nothing more than a piece of paper, a shield, a survival tactic forged in the storm. But on the long nights beside the great hearth, as they told each other about the strange dreams that came, her dreams of Elias smiling and nodding in approval, his dreams of Margaret placing a blessing hand on Abigail's shoulder, true love quietly took root. Not loud, not the burning blaze of youth, but deep, steady like the underground springs that fed the entire valley. One summer evening, when a perfect full moon hung above the black hills, Nathaniel took Abigail's hand and led her out to the wildflower meadow Lucy had seeded. He knelt for only the second time in his life, not to beg for survival, but to offer the rest of his days. "I have lived half a life until you came," he said, voice trembling. Abigail bent down, kissed his forehead, tears rolling, "And I was merely surviving until you taught me how to live again." The children needed no explanation. They felt the shift in the family's air, the way grass feels spring. One morning Benjamin quietly called Nathaniel Papa, while asking him to tie a shoe. Lucy climbed into his lap every night, demanding stories about the angel mother named Margaret. Nothing forced, nothing competed, for only children's hearts, recognizing that love is never divided, it only multiplies. The archetypes of father and mother had been reborn, not as replacements, but as complements, forming the complete family mandala Jung, described in psychology and alchemy. The self is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. CW 12 par. 44. The center of that circle was no longer pain, but the warm presence of four people who had chosen one another. Abigail never removed Elias's wedding ring from her left hand, nor did she ever take off the tiny ring of Margaret, the one Nathaniel had once meant for the daughter, who never drew breath that he silently slipped onto her right hand during their second wedding, this time beneath an ancient oak, with the entire valley as witness, left hand honoring the past, right hand embracing the present. The two rings touched whenever she worked, producing a faint chime like wind bells, reminding her that healing is not forgetting. It is holding both light and darkness whole. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Abigail had done it. She accepted that she was Elias's widow, Nathaniel's wife Benjamin, and Lucy's mother, and the woman who had once killed to protect her family, all coexisting inside a single, whole, radiant Abigail. The final scene of this journey unfolded on an October dusk, when earth and sky burned the color of rebirth flame. The whole family sat on the wide porch, Nathaniel playing an old guitar, Abigail resting her head on her husband's shoulder, Benjamin and Lucy sprawled on the grass, giggling as the new hunting dog bounded around them. The wind carried the scent of dry grass and wildflowers. Abigail closed her eyes and let the warmth of the present soak into every cell. In that moment she heard Elias whisper from the depths of the unconscious, "You did well, Abby." And she smiled a smile that held no shadow at all. She knew she had truly come back to life, not by forgetting death, but by turning death into a living part of eternal life. This is the true ending of every Jungian journey, not to become a perfect human being, but to become a whole one. Abigail Thornton Cole walked from the dead end of the shadow to the summit of the self, from a destitute widow to the sovereign queen of her own life. And she did it not alone, but together with a man who had once been a dying stranger in a blizzard, together with two children who embodied the future, and together with an entire community that finally learned to face its own collective darkness. My dear friend, if today you are carrying an old wound, if you are afraid to open the door to some stranger, whether it be an opportunity, a relationship, or a rejected part of yourself, remember this story. Remember that it is precisely in the act of saving another that you yourself are truly saved. And as Carl Jung wrote in the closing lines of Memories, Dreams, Reflections, I am astonished, disappointed, pleased with myself. I am distressed, depressed, rapturous. I am all these things at once, and cannot add up the sum. I am all that I have lost, and all that I have gained. I am the whole of it. Abigail became the whole of herself. Now it is time for you to do the same. See you again in the next stories of the unconscious. Live, love, and dare to face the darkness, for that is the only way the light will ever truly belong to you.